My name is Raymond Laureano-Ortiz. I'm based in Puerto Rico and an independent researcher affiliated with the Center for Advanced Studies on Puerto Rico and the Caribbean here in the island in Old San Juan as director for several research projects, PhD history projects, Caribbean and Puerto Rico history projects. I'm also an engineer, a management consultant, and a doctor in in Puerto Rico and Caribbean history. Um, I'm also collaborating, or I have collaborated with multiple organizations, I was chair president of the UK Society for Caribbean Studies, also vice president of the Association for Caribbean Historians, and right now I'm vice president for the Caribbean Studies Association, just fostering these spaces for knowledge exchange at the academic scholarly level. Um, yes, basically that.
Oh, thank you very much, and really looking forward to this conversation with you. So, well, today I'd like to know a bit more about Puerto Rico and the position of Puerto Rico when it comes to its relationship with the United States. So, maybe just to start this conversation, could you tell us a bit more about Puerto Rico's colonial past? What is the history of Puerto Rico? And in order for us to understand how this past has influenced its current political and economic relations with the US.
Yes, Puerto Rico for 400 years was part of Spain. It was a colony of Spain until 1898. It was one of the last colonies in the Americas with Cuba. And precisely in 1898, when the United States intervened in the Cuban independence war with Spain, U.S. It then became the U.S. the Spanish American War. I'm sorry, and as a result of that war, the U.S. Got Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines from Spain. So since then, we have been a territory of the U.S. And in 1952, we became a free associated state of the United States, meaning that we had more control over our local matters. Um, well, at least that was the intention. That has been a debate since then because the legal framework for that has a lot of gray areas, and there is a constant debate on how large is the space that that Puerto Rico has, the autonomous space that Puerto Rico has. So every year since then, the federal government, every agency in the executive that is trying to implement the program has to study what's the space that Puerto Rico has in terms of autonomy before they implement to determine whether certain programs apply or not to Puerto Rico. Every time the Congress is passing a law that somehow involves Puerto Rico, also they have to determine, how large is that space, and even the judicial system, the court system, the federal court system in the U.S. Many times they find cases where Puerto Rico is involved, and they also go about doing this analysis. So every year there's a constant analysis of how large is that space. Sometimes that space is interpreted as being small, sometimes broader. Um, More recently, however, there have been more consistent in determining that it is quite small because certain things have been happening, especially on the economic side. Congress decided in 2016 that we needed to have a financial oversight board. They passed the law known as PROMESA. It's an acronym in English that, however, in Spanish translates into promise. But that establishes an oversight board that actually um, decides whether the decisions of our elected officials the governor and our legislature um, are are in place and are appropriate to make sure that we pay our public debt. Uh, so that there is a lot of debate over that.
And how has the implementation of PROMESA impacted Puerto Rico, and in terms of its economy, the autonomy, and the governance? Uh,
Yes, there is a lot of concern again because we have elected officials, and then PROMESA, which was established by Congress, um, is passing judgment on what our officials do, and we have to clarify that we are a free associated state of the U.S., and you know that the political system of the U.S. is comprised of 50 states, the capital city, the District of Columbia, and also eight associated states. Three of them are sovereign nations. That's the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, and five of them are associated states that have different degrees of control over their local matters. But all of them are subject to the powers of Congress. Congress is the one that has the final say, because these five states, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Samoa, Northern Marianas, and Guam, they are subject to Congress. They are managed, all of them except Puerto Rico, by the Department of Interior, the U.S. Department of Interior. Puerto Rico matters were originally handled by that department, but now they are handled by a special White House task force. But the point here is that the these territories are under the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution, which is the legal framework to manage federal lands, including national parks. And they assigned uh, the the affairs of these five territories to that department. And again, Congress has full control over what happens in federal lands, in public lands, and also because of that, in the five territories. And that includes also the indigenous lands within the continental US and in Alaska and in Hawaii. So that's the context of this oversight board. They could do that,
and
and
about the situation, then, what does it mean for citizenship as a Puerto Rican? Um, are you a second class citizen? Because, like, can you make decisions, for example, when you're voting for elected representatives, or when other Americans are voting? Are you also voting for the same things?
yes, I'll go to that after I just clarify one more point. In 1952, we became the free associated state, but then in 1953, Puerto Rico and the U.S. went to the United Nations, to the Decolonization Committee, to make sure that Puerto Rico was taken out of the list of colonies or dependent territories, because now we had a different relationship. It was a one-to-one relationship as equals, where we had a social level of autonomy that allowed us to move around and have more control over our matters. So that's why all these interpretations that came afterward are a contradiction to that. Yes, the oversight board has made many Puerto Ricans feel that we are second class citizens because, again, we were given space to elect our own officials, to have control over our local matters, and having an oversight board goes totally against that. We do not have representation in Congress, voting representation in Congress, like each one of the 50 states. So that's why the laws that are made there are made without taking our um, consent, our side of the story. We do have one representative in Congress, which is called the resident commissioner. This person is in the House of Representatives. You know that Congress has two chambers, Senate and House of Representatives, and this person does not have a vote, but has a voice, not in the main floor of the House, but at the committee and subcommittee level. So, and that's the same case for the other five territories. They have one representative at the House of Representatives with voice but no vote. So
And is
again,
it one person that has to attend all the different committees and subcommittees, or can you have more people?
it's just one person. This person has the office, has an office, and they have a staff, but it's just one person that officially represents Puerto Rico.
So it must be very difficult. You have to choose which subcommittee you go on, and do you have
There
to
are
be
certain
assigned? Do you have to choose at the beginning of the mandate which committees you will attend, or can you attend anyone you want?
there are certain key committees where most issues of the territories are discussed, like Ways and Means, for example, in the House, and the Finance Committee in the Senate. Those are two key committees where our representative goes to make sure that she's there. Right now, we have Jennifer Gonzalez as our representative, and by the way, she's running for governor in the next elections. Um, so yeah, it is a situation where again, we don't have enough control over our local matters, although on paper, we do because of that constitution. But again, that constitution has a lot of gray areas. And there have been exercises across history to try to clarify that, but they have not um, ended with a sought after result, no, of having a change in the laws, in the legal framework. After having Puerto Rico officials and US officials, which is key, discussing ways to clarify the free association or having a plebiscite that is binding and it has each one of the options clearly defined. So, with a transition plan that was done back in 1989 through 1991. But after the consultations were made, again, U.S. Officials and consultants, attorneys, and Puerto Rican leaders and attorneys, um, the bill uh, did not didn't get on time to Congress before the session ended, and that was in two different sessions. Um, but that one had like a complete transition plan for each one of the options: independence, statehood, and free association. And before that, the only all other binding vote was in 1968. The free association won, so there were some exercises that were made to get presidential vote at least, because we don't vote for the president either. But that didn't reach an agreement locally, um, and mostly not because they were not in agreement on the idea. It was because of political uh, power struggles. Later, that was in 1972, and then between 1973 and 76, the exercise between U.S. officials under Nixon and then President Ford, and then the local government officials and attorneys under Rafael Hernandez Colon, then governor. They did a pretty exhaustive analysis of how to solidify the free association. But again, they did a bill, but it didn't get the congressional attention because the session ended. Um, President Ford, who had committed to send that to Congress, didn't do it because he was running for president. Reagan was challenging him to be a president, and then he needed local support, and local support came from the opponents of the government that was working on that clarification of the free association. It came from the pro statehood supporters. So they told Ford, do not get that bill to Congress. So, I mean, we have gone through some exercises to get the U.S. attention to do something about the status, but sometimes, yeah, local officials uh, they neutralize each other's efforts, and nothing happens, in the way that we need.
Could you give more examples of how this legal status of Puerto Rico is affecting people living in Puerto Rico, as opposed to someone that would be living in any other state in the U.S.?
I mean, again, we don't have representatives in Congress. We don't vote for the president. So there you have, every law that is passed by Congress in theory applies to Puerto Rico, but we don't have participation in voting for them in that exercise to determine whether it is good for us or not. Although we have a voice, but again, it's a voice, no vote. So we don't have more influence over that. So, for example, Social Security benefits, we pay Social Security tax at the same level every other state does. Every one of the 50 states do. But there are certain benefits from Social Security that we don't get to the full extent. We only get the percentage. And that's a concern for us. After contributing to that, we don't get the same level of benefits. And more interesting is that you can be working in the US, you being Puerto Rican or from some other background in the US. All your life, you live in Puerto Rico, you pay, I'm sorry, in the mainland US, you pay your taxes, the Social Security taxes, and if you decide you want to retire to Puerto Rico and become a resident here, you will get the lower percentage of the benefit here. So it is tied to the territory as opposed to you being Puerto Rican. But again, most people decide they want to live here.
And when it comes to other rights or other elements of daily life, for example, access to healthcare and medicines, or are there other ways as well that the local residents are affected?
Of course, you know that Social Security includes Medicare, which is the government plan in retirement. That affects also the amount of money that you get as a benefit uh, uh, during your late years, golden years, in terms of getting your health services. Um, Also on the trade side, um, we we are a separate tax jurisdiction. We are like a foreign country as well as all the other possessions uh, for tax purposes. So when the U.S. is negotiating trade agreements, if it is going to include Puerto Rico, it has to like do the same amount of effort that it does to analyze the tax scheme, because again, Puerto Rico is a separate uh, jurisdiction, and that's because the U.S. government decided to do it that way. Um, since the 1910s and 1920s, there have been a special part of the tax code that allows uh, U.S. corporations to create special corporations to do business in the possessions. The most recent section of that tax code was Section 936. The original one, I think it was 120 something. So Section 120 something allowed, back in the 1910s and 1920s, um, U.S. corporations to create a special corporations to do business in the Philippines, which was a possession back then. They were concerned that the British traders were doing much better than U.S. traders in the Philippines. And by having this special corporation, they have very special tax benefits in the U.S. They many times they practically pay no tax in the U.S. They pay the taxes in the possession, um, and that's what we had between 1976 and 1996, and that was key for the pharmaceutical industry, biotech, and also electronics manufacturing. Back then, we were a hub for those industries. We are still for the pharma and the biotech, but not at the level we were back then. All these pharma companies were creating 936 companies, Section 936, and they were paying no tax at the federal level, and they were paying our taxes. Our tax for local companies is 30%. But then we had these special arrangements with U.S. corporations, 936 corporations, where they would pay 10%, 4% tax. So they had great terms. And back in the U.S., they were not paying anything because they were giving them credit for the full tax uh, rate that they were supposed to pay here, which was 30%, but they were actually paying 10 or 4%. Of course, those local tax incentives are available for local companies, not only US companies, and international companies if they came to do manufacturing or what we call export services. Exported services is just to have headquarters here to provide services outside. It could be the US, the Caribbean, any other part of the world. So there is an economic scheme there that works well for US companies, and probably that's one factor that influences, elections from that side. No, whatever, that's aside from what people might think, right,
Yeah.
about certain
But you
ideas.
said also like that mainland US has oversight over Puerto Rico because of the deficit. But
Right.
on one hand, but on the other hand, you say that when US companies come to do business in Puerto Rico, they don't really pay taxes. So how can you develop a bit further this element of the story? Because I find it interesting to see um, how can the US be maybe effectively blocking the growth and the financial stability of Puerto Rico with this kind of policies. Also, if there are any other challenges that you can um, identify and share with us.
Yes, I mean, this scheme has spurred a certain degree of development, but locally we need to create the awareness. And I was part of the economic development team at some point, but it was hard to get everyone to agree that we needed to have some other initiatives that somehow helped the local people develop their businesses, and special programs, maybe tax programs that allow them to eh, have a good startup and then further develop. Uh, and also somehow tie up these benefits for U.S. companies to some other benefits for the community. I think I mentioned at some point in some discussions that, for example, if you are going to give this special tax break to this pharma company, make sure that they enter into an agreement to have their PhDs in the sciences teach for free in the local universities to transfer that knowledge. Have them create community centers for with local access to internet, free access to internet, and likewise for local businesses. We have a lot of entrepreneurship programs now, privately run, and some of them are public. So it is a good thing to see the government getting into these entrepreneurship programs. Um, but right now, although we don't have Section 936, we have some other tax breaks for US companies, but are tax breaks that they can use in any other country, not only the possessions. They call it the CFCs, the Control Foreign Corporations. And at the same time, they added some other tax breaks for private investors, individual investors that come from abroad, tax breaks that are not available locally. Uh, So that's part of the situation that needs to be addressed. Because okay, you're impacting economic development with these investors, but we need to you need to look closely the effects of having all these investors coming to Puerto Rico, buying properties, but then not entering into a commitment to develop the property. The property just sits there until they see that the prices go up, and then they sell it, as opposed to the idea of having them buy them and develop, making sure that the community is also involved. So
And
many areas
can
there.
the Puerto Rican officials, political appointees, and government actually do anything about that, or is this something that should be done in Washington, and basically they have no possibility to change things?
These particular situations that I'm talking about,
Yes.
these are local laws. U.S. companies have their incentives in the U.S., but then when they come here, they get some other incentives. Uh, and then these incentives for investors, contrary to the incentives that I mentioned for that U.S. corporations are using, that one is available for local companies, Puerto Rico companies, also international companies. But these tax breaks for specific investors is only available for people from abroad. So it is up to us to change that and see how we incorporate uh, uh, ways to support the local entrepreneurs, the local investors, as opposed to just giving those benefits to those that come from abroad. And also, again, adding some measures that somehow take care of these tendencies that we see. Again, these investors buying property everywhere, not doing anything with them, forcing the prices to go up, and then it is not accessible to local people to buy their houses, their properties to do their business and the like.
And why has not this not been implemented before? Is there something that prevents decision makers to do this? Is it because of the relationship with the US that they can't do it?
Yes, because for some reason they have this idea that it is easier to deal with people from the US as opposed to local people. So there is a mindset there that is influencing this. Some people say that it is, they're used to the colonial mindset and thinking that everything that comes from um, the US is better and
That's an
it is
amazing segue
easier to
to
handle.
it's an amazing segue to my next question about the cultural identity of Puerto Rico and nationalism. Um, how does this situation with the US influence the national culture of Puerto Rico? You speak about a colonial mindset. Could you develop on this?
Yes, and I said some people say it is the colonial mindset because personally, sometimes I get concerned that everything is attributed to the colonial mindset when there are situations where local people show some initiative in this context and everything and some people tend to minimize even the good things that can help us gain some self-confidence and collaborate among different parties and community groups to to have a common project to move forward the country. But um, Puerto Ricans have a very distinctive sense of identity. Back in the 30s, there were writers, journalists, academia people that were writing about what was being a Puerto Rican, and they were the first that actually started to formalize this idea that Puerto Ricans were a mix of Spanish, African, and indigenous, Taino Indians. And they were talking about Spanish as being our language, although that was the first part of the 20th century. And during that period, the US was imposing English as the language of instruction in education. So they started to promote this idea that Spanish was our language, that we were either more aligned with Latin America in cultural terms than the U.S. or any other part of the world. That yes, we were part of the Caribbean, but that identification was not as strong as the Latin American side of it. And some other ideas, and also the identification with the land, with the island, um, and this longing for the island, right? Whenever you went outside, those ideas from the 30s, when we became a free associated state and we had more control over local matters, at least in theory, there was an agency that was created called the Puerto Rico Institute of Culture, Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña. It was headed by Ricardo Alegría. And he took all those ideas and somehow he started to project them into the population as this is the Puerto Rican culture. And they had programs on theater, dance, art, all kinds of expressions. And they were promoting this way of feeling and sensing ourselves. He then started working with the Department of Education, and that's why every textbook in the Department of Education has these ideas inserted. And that's why even today, that has continued, that even today we feel like, yeah, we are a mix of heritages, the European, the Indian, the indigenous, and the African. Although those ideas were also also included like this notion that maybe the Spanish was a superior culture than the other two, and that caused problems, and those are things that we are still working on today. But the thing is that the Puerto Rican identity is very distinctive because we were taught since we were in kindergarten during our entire experience in school that we were a set of people that were different, and Spanish was important, and this mix of heritages was important, and the like. You talk to someone in the diaspora, in New York, in Florida, in Texas, they will tell you, "Oh, yo soy boricua para que tú lo sepas." I'm Puerto Rican. Boricua is the name for a Puerto Rican, the indigenous name. So they feel very proud and very distinctive, and you'll see Puerto Rican parades in every other city in the U.S. Celebrating the heritage. Um, but then at the same time, part of that identity also includes, following closely the political parties that have been organized since the 60s on around a specific political status preference. So since the late 60s, we have had these two main parties that have been taking turns in government. We have elections every 4 years. So every 4 years, we almost had like uh, a, a change from one party to the other. You have the party that is pro statehood, that's the new progressive party, and the pro free association party, uh, which is the Popular Democratic Party. Uh, Between the two, they have had 96% of the vote since the late 60s until recently. Each one of them would get like 48%. Um, uh, One of them with a few more votes than the other, and that's what determined which one of them was in control. Um, and then most of the political campaigns um, were focused mostly on political status. What political status you want in the future, as opposed to what do you need in education, in economic development. Those were not the issues that were discussed with um, the people in general. It was political status and who was wittier in terms of uh, saying something minimizing the other, but the opponent.
And what are the main arguments of each side? So those that are more for the statehood and those that want to remain a free state. How do they present the advantages of their view?
Yeah, pro statehood is always making sure that people are afraid of independence. And actually, and even the other side too. Back in the 50s, there were some coordinated efforts that criminalized um, the pro independence movements. And so they were setting up binders with details of the life of many people that were pro independence, las carpetas, they would call them. You are carpeteando the pro-independence supporters. So people, and that went on for in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and people got afraid of independence because they even thought, or even if you just mentioned independence, people would think that you were going to be persecuted by the government. So with that clarified, that's why they would get like 4% or less of the vote in every election since the late 60s. The pro statehood people built on the fear that people had on independence, and they would say we need to be a state because we need to preserve our relationship with the US. We have all these social programs, so if we separate, we will lose them all. Um, and some social programs will have more money at our disposal because of what I just mentioned. Um, and the pro free association people, which were the ones that built all this identity for Puerto Ricans with the Institute of Culture, they would say no statehood because we have the best of both worlds. We have this relationship with the US. Of course, yes, it is true that they get a little confused sometimes with what our original agreement was, which was uh, um, an agreement between two equals, and they forget about it and they interpret wrong. But we have this relationship with the US. We have the social programs, and we have our own identity. If we become a state, we will lose our identity. They will force us to speak English. Um, we will lose our representation in the Olympics because that's another field of study. Many academic scholars have focused on how Puerto Rico representation in sports and some other fields become this channel to manifest the identity to the world, that we are a different people. So the Pro Free Association people say you will lose representation in the Olympics, even in Miss Universe, in the beauty pageants, because that's big here too, interestingly. Um, so, and then both of them say independence is not an option because we don't have the resources to sustain ourselves. Uh, but then more recently, it has been interesting to observe the election results. Two elections ago, in 2016, that 96% of the vote between the two main forces, the two parties I have been talking about, suddenly went down to 80%. And the options that we had were the Independence Party, they got just only 1%. The ones that actually got significant support from most of those 20% of the votes were two independent candidates with no political party affiliation. That was the first time we had candidates to governor. It was a 35-year-old attorney, a woman, that captured the imagination of many people because of the way she would communicate. Uh, she went to the point, and many young people just went for her. And also a 60-year-old Cuban-born entrepreneur, very well known because of his bakeries in the island. So between the two, they captured that amount of votes, that number of votes, and they were not proposing a specific political status. They were proposing a process in which everyone could participate and delucidate the ideas on the best way to propose a change to the US. That
But
again,
isn't not proposing any status just saying that we will keep status quo, we'll just keep the current situation and we focus on internal affairs?
no, there were, we will focus on the internal affairs, and we will have a process to change what we have, because we are a colony and we need to change it. But we
Okay.
need to propose something that we agree on, and maybe have something similar to what happened in between 1989 and 1991, where you had OUS officials and Puerto Rico officials. That change, and anyway, the two main forces, they always propose um, to make us a state or continue evolving the free association, but nothing really happens in 4 years. So it's not like they are like doing something for to make a change either. So in 2020, which was the last election, that trend of a decreasing support to the two main political parties, which had gone from 96% to 80% between the two, went down to 65% in the last elections. And the two main forces that got that percentage, the difference, about 30 something percent, were two movements. One is a movement that comes from the communities that was not proposing a specific, again, status option, but a process to address the situation. The Independence Party. Each one of them got 15%, 15 something, 16, 17, each one of them. Independence Party, for the first time in decades, gets a significant support. They, during the campaign, were saying that they were a party for everyone, not only pro independence supporters, because they were going to be managing all the issues that we were facing, and they were going to have a process where everyone could contribute to change the colonial status. So that was key, I think, for their success. And now for these elections, again, you have the two parties that used to be the main political forces, but then you have a third force where you have an alliance between the pro-independence and the community, the party that comes from the communities, and they are capturing the attention of the people. So they have a good possibility of winning.
So these elections will take place on the 5th of November 2024, and they will also coincide with the referendum about the status of Puerto Rico. What will be the options available to Puerto Ricans when they go to vote?
I will answer that after I clarify one point, that the two traditional parties, so according to political strategies, are really concerned about this alliance, and apparently they think that they could win, and they are looking for strategies to derail that support that they are getting. So political strategies say that the pro-statehood party is proposing precisely this referendum on status as one of those strategies to derail the support to that alliance. Because traditionally, plebiscites get people excited about elections and about the ideas. Just listening to leaders go back and forth. Again, seeing who is wittier, and who says what to the other one. And so we have had like about 5, 6, 7 plebiscites on status. Only one of them has been binding to Congress because they organized it. There was an exercise, as I mentioned, of one other that never was, that was going to be binding. And then the others have been, they say, criollo plebiscites. Um, local ones, because they are non-binding. Uh, and they do it because they think that that's a way to mobilize people to go to vote. And yes, they do some efforts to go to Congress and try to convince them that people have voted, but usually they have voted to keep the free association until one of the most recent ones. The majority went for statehood, but it was under a context in which the free association people decided that it was not a it was not leading to anything. So that's why they were inviting the free association supporters not to go. That's why statehood got more votes. Um, this one plebiscites is offering statehood, independence, and free association. Very a special kind of free association, because within the group of free association supporters, you have two ideas. One of them is keep the free associated state that we have under the territorial clause of the Constitution of the U.S., which is the one that creates problems, because it's the one that is used to say that Congress has full power over the territories, as the same way it has over public land, national parks, and the like. And actually, the legal framework says that Congress has full power over the territories unless there is a constitution. But they have been interpreting that as the institution not being strong enough to keep the Congress from intervening. So you have those that want to keep the free association under the territorial clause, but with changes to have more control over local matters, as the original idea was, and those that want to have free association as a sovereign nation, as a free nation, like Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau, who have a seat in the United Nations, but they have a free association agreement with the US to handle certain things like currency and security, defense. So you have the ones that want the sovereign Puerto Rico in free association, and others that want to keep Puerto Rico as a free associated state, but of course with changes. Um, so what is being offered in the referendum is the sovereign Puerto Rico with a free association agreement with the US. So the people in the pro free association that wants to continue under the Constitution of the US feel that they are not being represented in that plebiscite. So there
Okay.
is a debate there.
Yeah, yeah. And what about the point of view of the U.S. government? So, from the research on the political landscape in Puerto Rico, you've helped me by providing me with some sources. There doesn't seem to be a partisan divide in Puerto Rico when it comes to the different statuses. It doesn't mean that if you're pro statehood that you're a Republican, and if you're pro free state you're a Democrat. But the other way around, what would be, for example, the consequence for Puerto Rico if Kamala Harris won, as opposed to having Donald Trump win the presidency? How would this affect the situation of Puerto Rico?
I have to mention that we have a local Democratic Party and a local Republican Party that do not participate in the local elections. They just elect the people that will go to the uh, national conventions of the two main parties in the U.S. Because although we do not vote for president, we are allowed by the two main parties to vote within their organizations to elect the candidate for president. So we have those two local parties that are geared towards that. Traditionally, Republican Party people came from the pro-statehood party, and the Democratic Party came from a mix from the statehood party and the free association party. Actually, for many years, it had two local presidents, one coming from one local party and one pro statehood, one pro free association, and they were very successful in advancing certain things. Um, I just read that the Republican Party just took out of their platform supporting statehood for Puerto Rico, which was the official uh, stand. So that's it for on that side. And actually, the resident commissioner, our representative in Congress right now, is on the Republican side, and he's the one that is running for governor. And then uh, the Democratic Party usually supports self determination. So you Puerto Ricans decide, and then I act on whatever you tell me. But that's a little tricky because if you don't have conversations from the beginning with them, you have a non-binding plebiscite. Um, there is no guarantee that anything will happen after that.
And the track record of Donald Trump is not great when it comes to supporting Puerto Ricans, I have to say.
That's right. Actually, he had a lot of businesses here in Puerto Rico. He was very happy with Puerto Rico for a long time. But then when he became president, maybe playing to some of his supporters, or more than supporters, like political analysts, he paid attention to a lot of political analysts that came with this conclusions about Puerto Rico that maybe made no sense, and he heard them a lot. Yeah, he was not very supportive when Hurricane Maria destroyed the island. It went through the island, and we were with no power in many parts of the island for a year. Um, um, a significant amount of money was approved, but he stopped all the federal agencies from distributing that money. And it was not until last year, from 2017 to last year, that agencies started to implement programs where they were distributing the money. There's one thing about the Democratic Party. Usually, the Republican Party is not happy about Puerto Rico becoming a state, because if we become a state, there is the impression that we are going to be a Democratic Party state, and that means you know that would have an impact on the balance of powers between the two parties in Congress, because we have more population than half of the states, uh, and that makes a difference. In the Senate, we
That
will
could
have two people,
tip the
but
balance on some of the elections, the ones that the close call, that might have an impact then.
yeah, you have more
And
population.
so,
Yes.
is there any hope for any change in the situation of Puerto Rico after, for example, this referendum is non-binding either?
No,
I
it's
did,
not. It is not binding. It's
so
not
this
binding.
is not gonna really change anything. So what are the possibilities at the horizon? Also, when it comes to the independence movement of Puerto Rico, is there? Well, you can't predict the future, but based on what you're seeing, do you think that they are potentially gonna gain more momentum in the future?
Before answering that, I wanted to share something very interesting, that this administration, which is pro statehood in Puerto Rico, in 2020 passed a law to elect 6 delegates to to Congress, following what they call the Tennessee Plan, the state of Tennessee. When before becoming a state, they elected representatives to Congress without even being accepted to Congress. So following that, they had this election. They selected 4 representatives to the House of Representatives in Washington and 2 senators. I'm sorry, two representatives to the Senate. And they have been working since 2021. I'm looking forward to see their reports, to work for statehood, to speak for statehood. So we will have to see what happens with that when they file their official reports. So that have been one more strategy to gain statehood. But I just told you, Republican Party just took statehood out of their platform where it apparently was placed before. Um, I think that there's a good chance that the alliance wins, the Independence Party and the community based party. Um, but if it doesn't win, it continues to break ground to offer the population different options and different topics in which to focus moving forward. Let's talk about this, and this. And in terms of status, let's talk about something that really, really help us move forward as a group of people. We will have this process, and they have some specific recommendations. So I have the hope that that will continue, that trend will continue, and somehow uh, lead us to a way to overcome all this. Meanwhile, there are many things that can be done, and there are many private parties, foundations that are supporting local entrepreneurs, making them think in global terms, and also they are supporting community leaders that are doing different projects to make communities self-reliant in terms of energy, in terms of economic terms, um, and also awareness of political access. Uh, and somehow I hope to be contributing to that. I wrote a textbook for high school that started to be used this past month for this year. And it is a textbook that puts Puerto Rico in context in the international arena. So it is a way to create awareness that we are global citizens. We can be effective citizens, global citizens from the local, from our reality, from our context, from our identity. And also that I'm trying to create this awareness that we are a global community. Puerto Rico is a global community. It's a network. And like other networks, like including the US during the 19th century, it was the global networks of business people that allowed it in many ways to gain the prominence that it had in the 20th century. So hopefully with the book, I'm trying to create an open mind, and inviting to have an open mind to what is happening in the world. And when they see what's happening in the world, they have a better criteria to evaluate what's going on here in Puerto Rico and go for whatever is leading us to a path where we have more control over our local matters.
And so you said it's great to put Puerto Rico in context, and well, the element that strikes me most is the fact that you're at the center of the Caribbean. So, what are the relationships between Puerto Rico and its neighbors, and how could this actually help Puerto Rico grow and have more opportunities? Maybe no matter what the status that is chosen, because for example, the French Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe are also in the Caribbean, and they also are part of an entity that's far away. They do have more rights than Puerto Rico, I have to say, comparatively. So how can Puerto Rico, and does Puerto Rico already do it? But how is Puerto Rico working with its neighbors as part of a community of Caribbean states?
Yes, I have written about the history of Puerto Rico relations with the Caribbean in general, and specifically with CARICOM, which is probably the most well-known organization in the region, the Caribbean region, of which Puerto Rico is part. Uh, and Puerto Rico is not as active as it used to back in the 50s and 60s, when the metropoles, the countries outside the region that had territories in here, opened some spaces for collaboration among territories. That was the Anglophone Commission, then the Caribbean Commission, then the Caribbean Organization. That was from the 40s through the 60s. Puerto Rico was very active. That was the first time Puerto Rican leaders had an opportunity to share with people from Martinique, Guadeloupe, and some other parts of the Anglophone Caribbean, which were colonies back then. So that somehow helped us, solidify our Caribbean identity, at least among the leaders back then. Um, then we were very active in the organization of the Caribbean Development Bank and CARICOM. We're very active, but at the end, because of some technicalities or not having enough time to continue taking care of that, and maybe focusing too much on the internal affairs, political power struggles internally in Puerto Rico, we are not part of CARICOM. But we were going to be one of the founding members. Uh, Later on in 1990, we became an observer of CARICOM because we had a group of officials, government officials, that was very interested in inserting us, not only in the region but in other world networks, and they leverage on what was available. The associate membership is available in many of these international organizations, as opposed to a full membership, which is reserved for sovereign nations, independent nations. So Puerto Rico leveraged that back in the late 80s, early 90s, and continued through the 90s. But in the 2000s, it started like having a more reserved, uh, more less activity. Uh, Probably because there were many things going on internally in Puerto Rico, and they were not paying as much attention there. Plus, um, international relations is a game of interpersonal relations, and some pro-statehood officials were concerned about Puerto Rico occupying spaces that were reserved for the U.S. And they were talking to the U.S. Department of State officials, saying this is dangerous. And that generation of officials during this century has been more on the side of looking with suspicion what Puerto Rico is doing, as opposed to it is just leveraging every possible space to advance its agenda, economic agenda, and the like. And that's what is happening with Martinique and Guadeloupe. They are leveraging that. I have a very good friend and colleague, Janis Lacascat, that is heading that for Martinique. He already inserted Martinique into the Organization of Eastern Caribbean State. He's working on CARICOM. He worked on La CEPAL, ECLAC before, for Martinique, also for French Guiana. Because surprisingly, the French government, which used to be like one of the most centralized governments, passed this law allowing the territories or the parts of France that are overseas to participate in their respective regional circles. So that was really surprising. Now the implementation is proving quite a challenge, but it is good that they have the framework for it, as opposed to maybe the U.S., which is not there yet. Although by reading a little bit about the French Caribbean and the Pacific Caribbean, the French Pacific, I'm sorry, French Pacific, to get ready for this conversation, I saw that the US has been taking steps in recognizing uh, uh, French territories and even US territories, allowing them to do certain things that they are not allowing us in the Caribbean. So there is some research space there to explore.
Yeah, definitely. And another question is, what about the pro-independence side? So, um, who are their example in the world, in the Caribbean? Are they looking up to any sovereign states in the Caribbean, for example? As because I guess um, everyone that's against the independence of Puerto Rico will use Haiti as the scarecrow and say, well, if you get independence, you'll be as poor as Haiti. No, that's the easy one. But what are the examples for those that actually want independence for Puerto Rico?
well, the ones that well, the opponents of independence point to Haiti, and they refer to them as the banana republics. You know, Central America and some other Caribbean countries that in the past were banana exporters. Um, Independence, uh, some pro-independence at some point in the past were looking at Cuba, but out of admiration, of what they have done against the U.S., uh, standing against the U.S. And in terms of economic terms, there are many different models like Singapore, like the Scandinavian countries with a social democrat form of government. Um, which others? Even Costa Rica, which has remained neutral in many global uh, situation, no? Conflicts. Uh, but they have. We were talking to them of specifically to the candidate to governor for the independence movement and the alliance, and he was saying that we have the capabilities, and we just have to be strategic about the tax system, the tax scheme that we have, to make sure that we are fair to everyone. And he was talking about the global tax that is being discussed worldwide as one way to go. Um, and anyway, no matter what status we have to deal with powers like the U.S. I mean, if we become an independent nation, we have to deal with the US agenda, the China agenda, the Russian agenda, and see how we move around those. If we become a state, we have to navigate the agenda of the 50 states, the territories, the federal agenda to move our agenda. As a free associated state is the same. We have to look at both sides. Um, so yeah, they're just trying to make people think and leave aside that fear from the Cold War of being afraid of independence and associating independence with communism, which in itself there's nothing wrong with it, but here it was used to make people very fearful. And actually, this past week, a very intense campaign started from the pro-statehood party, associating the pro-independence leader to communism, to Maduro, to the leaders of Cuba, to the people in Bolivia, to the leaders in Bolivia, and they're being so very blunt. And they put the photos, and and we are the only ones that can fight communism today, 2024, year 2024, talking about that. Uh, so they're just uh, going to these strategies that create fear as opposed to talk about the issues, and what are the pros and cons of each one of the options that we have, and what can we do under this status to pay attention to these our daily challenges, and how each one of those status options could change the way we address all these daily challenges. Instead of talking about that, we are talking about these things that create fear.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for providing us with this very balanced analysis. After all, here I think we've covered most bases to understand the situation in Puerto Rico much better. So I would like to thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Max. My pleasure.
Thank you.